Alrighty, well, it is 12 and we are people who are on time. I'd like to get started. For those of you who don't know me, hi, my name is Indigo Dudley and I'm a senior here at Saginaw Valley State University. I am also a student program coordinator in the Office of Multicultural Student Affairs, and I am the vice president of the Organization of Black Unity here at Saginaw Valley. Before I introduce our speaker, I would like to thank our sponsors. So, Dow Visiting Scholars and Artists, the Office of Multicultural Student Affairs, the Office of Student Life, Conference Center and Events, and Student Association. Thank you, thank you, thank you for bringing this event to life. We could not have done it without you. Without further ado, it is my privilege to introduce you to our guest and keynote speaker, Feminista Jones. Feminista Jones is a Philadelphia-based feminist writer, public speaker, community activist, and semi-retired social worker. She is an award-winning blogger and the author of 4 books, including the critically acclaimed 2019 release, Reclaiming Our Space: How Black Feminists Are Changing the World from the Tweets to the Streets. Her writing and activism centers around Black American culture, feminism, critical race theory, intersectionality, mental health, poverty, and women's health and well-being. Feminista's passions are for writing and supporting marginalized people. Her writing has been featured in multiple renowned news outlets such as Essence, EBONY, New York Times, and many others. She has been a social worker for 17 years and has dedicated herself to advocating for people experiencing poverty, hunger, homelessness, substance addiction, and psychiatric disabilities. Feminista also sits on the board of the Wayfinder Foundation, a grant-making organization that invests in women making a difference in their underdeserved communities, and the Hope Center for Community College and Justice, a nonprofit research organization that advocates for the needs of disenfranchised college students. In 2014, she launched a global anti-street harassment campaign, #UOCases, and a national moment of silence protesting police brutality, which is #NMOS14, both which received international media attention. That same year, she was named one of the top 100 Black social influencers by The Root. In 2017, Feminista was named one of the most 100 influential people in Philadelphia by Philadelphia Magazine. And in 2018, she was featured in Philadelphia Style magazine for her community activism work. In 2019, Feminista joined 2 of her closest friends and created Black Girl Missing, a true crime podcast that focuses on the stories of missing Black girls in the U.S. And on top of all of that, she is a mom and a mentor to young girls and women, and she is outspoken. She is an outspoken advocate for the homeless, people in poverty, and those living in psychiatric disabilities. We know it's long, but you got to give credit where credit is due. You did that. so,
Oh man.
um, so for those listening, there is an option for Q&A during the discussion, not to be confused with the chat box. So if you have any questions that arise during the presentation, feel free to drop them, and I will be moderating. But without further ado, please help me welcome Feminista Jones.
Thank you so much. For those of you watching, I was teasing the pan. I said, this is so long. I always get weird when people are like reading my bio because I'm like, oh, gosh, I'm old. I'm so happy to be here today. We what's going on in the world? Who knows at this point, right? Some days you just kind of you want to laugh, you want to cry, you want to scream, you want to just, whatever. And in the midst of it all, particularly now, there is so much to be done, and there is so much for us to come together to do. And so what we're going to talk about today, and I'm going to share my screen and do all that wonderful things that we've gotten used to with Zoom or whatever. But I really just want to preface this by saying that it's really important that we not lose sight of our humanity. When I say that I'm a semi-retired social worker, is that, I ended my career, doing social work administration, and I stopped, right? But you never stop being a social worker. You never stop being somebody who cares. You never stop being a community organizer. You never stop being an activist. Even when you are just like, okay, I can't do as much, it's always there. It's always a part of who you are. So I joke and say that I'm semi-retired, because the minute I'm feeling compelled to hop back into really rolling my sleeves up and getting back into this work is the minute that I will, without hesitation. So, that's what we're going to talk about today, which I think is super, super important, has become increasingly important in recent years, is this idea of like social activism in the 21st century and like the social media's role in it, because I think it's one of the most, powerful tools that we have is social media. So let me get my screen together and then we'll hop right into it as people are still trickling in. Very happy to have you here. Thank you, Saginaw. Thank you, my Saginaw people, for having me here. Y'all are awesome. So hopefully y'all can see my screen. Yes, Saginaw people, somebody tell me in the chat everything is all good. We tested this before, but I just wanted to make sure. So today we are talking about social media and social justice in the 21st century, right? And there's an image there. For those that are listening, there's an image of people kneeled at a protest with their hands up. Because that's been happening a lot, right? A lot of people have been putting their hands up. And maybe we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So who am I and why do I do this? Some people may not know that my name is Feminista Jones, and some people may not know, that I have been an activist since I was 19 years old. And I date myself back to 19 because that was the first time I participated in organizing a demonstration. And that was actually on the campus of the University of Pennsylvania, where I went as an undergrad, and around that time we were the issue of affirmative action was really, really a big deal. And so we were protesting and letting our voices be heard that we were not going to stand by and let affirmative action be removed from higher education, right? So ever since then, I realized that I had a passion for this kind of activism and speaking up and fighting for what's right. I went into UPenn thinking I was going to be a lawyer, and I left becoming a social worker. I just realizing that I had the skills and the passion to kind of just be out there on the ground in the streets, working directly with people and trying to help them make immediate improvements on their lives. And that's not to say that the long-term work isn't needed. Absolutely is needed. We need the lawyers doing the policy work and all of the, influencing the legislature and things like that. But I also connected to that immediate need because of my own personal experiences in life. So, that's why I started doing this. I've always also had a passion for writing. Writing is like my creative passion. And so those are the two things that I've really worked on throughout my career. And so people, depending on when you've met me, is what you know me for. You may have known me as a blogger, you may have known me as an influencer, you may know me as a public speaker, as a writer, or what have you, as an activist, as somebody, as an organizer. So I do all those things, right? And I really, part of why I've pivoted a bit and I do these kinds of speaking engagements and these talks is, in the words of Angela Davis, is we have to talk about liberating minds as well as liberating society. And what do I mean by that? I mean that, we can make these changes and we can be in the streets with our demonstrations and we can push back against these negative behaviors and these harmful behaviors. But if we're not changing people's minds, the behaviors and the actions will continue. The laws will continue to pass. The police will continue to do what they do. The racists and the sexists and everybody will continue to do what they do until we can liberate people's minds. So I'm guided by that principle. And you will hear me talk about that a lot. So what are we going to talk about today? So today we are going to talk about the fundamentals of Black liberation and the relevance to this moment. And I always center everything, and we'll talk about that in a second, around the Black liberation movement, because that is where we are grounded. Everything comes from that. I'm going to talk about social media as a powerful tool for radical change. Again, I've studied movements for a very long time. One of those people is like, I'm not going to jump into doing something that I haven't studied and I don't know about. And social media is one of the most powerful things we've ever seen in the history of any kind of protest and revolution. We're going to talk a little bit about anti-racism, right? What is all of this talk about anti-racism? And then finally, we're going to talk about what's your personal responsibility? What is it that you're supposed to be doing in this moment? Okay. So, there's been a lot of conversation lately, do Black lives actually matter, or is it just trendy, right? And then a lot of us have had these conversations about, this idea of stating Black lives matter. What does it mean when we say that, right? What are we trying to prove? There's some people who feel like, it's a simple statement. It shouldn't be that controversial. It's matter of fact, right? And then people respond with all lives matter, as if, Black lives aren't part of that. It's a racist dog whistle. We know that. But what does it mean? And then there's other people who are like, why do we even have to state this? Who are we trying to prove this to? Who are we trying to convince that Black lives matter? And so I appreciate those conversations, because I think that's necessary for growth within this movement. If you see, there's a gentleman, for those of you that are listening, I have an image of Kwame Ture, formerly Stokely Carmichael, who was a very, very, very powerful activist and writer and orator back in the Black Power movement. And he said, Black power can be clearly defined for those who do not attach the fears of white America to their questions about it. Okay, so I'm going to say that again. Black power can clearly be defined. It's clear. It's clear to everybody. Black Lives Matter is clear to us, to those who do not attach the fears of white America to their questions about it, right? So we're not questioning whether or not Black lives matter. We're reacting to this fear that white America has about what happens when Black lives matter in the larger scheme of things. I hope that makes sense. And then he also says, now then, in order to understand white supremacy, we must dismiss the fallacious notion that white people can give anybody their freedom. We must dismiss the fallacious notion that white people can give anybody their freedom. And I like to ground my talks in that, because I know that I have all types of listeners and watchers and things like that, people of all races or what have you. And for centuries, we have all been convinced that white is right and white gets to determine how we all move forward with our own lives. And what he is saying and what we are saying as a part of Black liberation is the rejection of this idea that European descendants and white people have any right to determine the fate of people who are not European. Okay? And that is a powerful statement, right? So when we're talking about Black Lives Matter and we say those things, within that, if we dig into that, it's this idea that you can't even say that we don't matter, because you don't have that right, because you don't have that power. And the fact that we keep believing that there's somebody who could give us freedom, somebody who can give us liberation, that's where we remain stuck. Okay, I hope that makes sense. If you have questions, we'll have a moment in a second where we can talk about it, right? So you have another picture, image of James Baldwin, the gay writer, Black gay writer, whose popular works, Giovanni's Room and things like that, like people know. And he was also known for, really kind of speaking out about racial justice issues and Blackness. And so he says, a liberal is someone who thinks he knows more about your experience than you do, right? How relevant is that? And when we are on our social media and we are having our conversations, right, you have these people who are coming out and making these statements about Black lives and about the Black experience, or, the experience of Indigenous people, or the experience of, Latinx people, and speak with an authority as though they know more about what we do or what we live through than we do. And it's why you see white people being hired to do anti-racist, trainings and write books about anti-racism and the like, because people believe that somehow white people know better about our lives. And then he says, precisely at the point when you begin to develop a conscience, you must find yourself at war with your society. And I think that's really, really powerful, because I think what we're seeing now in this particular time, particularly with activism and how it is in the 21st century, there's an awakening that is happening, right? There are people who are just like, wow, I don't have to live this way. Concepts. I don't have to accept this. I don't have to exist in this society the way that, the powers have prescribed my life to be. I don't. I am now conscious of what the possibilities are, and that puts me at odds with the society I'm in. And that's where activism comes in, because activists are saying, what is going on in society right now is not right, and we need to fight to change it. Okay, so what I'm doing is I'm kind of giving you this grounding in where this even comes from. We didn't just wake up one day and say we want to protest the police. No, these have been conversations that have been happening for centuries. Okay, despite what your school may have taught you, we have been talking about this. We have been working towards this for centuries. Okay. And then we go back to Sister Davis, Dr. Davis. She says, I think the importance of doing activist work is precisely because it allows you to give back and to consider yourself not as a single individual who may have achieved whatever, but to be a part of an ongoing historical movement. And I think that that is so relevant to where we are right now and to the times. Because again, there's this awakening that is happening where people are just like, I can be a part of something bigger than myself. And the more of us that are involved in this collective awakening and this collective movement, the more powerful and effective it will be. Right. So as we are getting into this activist kind of work, this activism, it's not just about giving back. It's about being part of the collective that is going to move us forward and change the world. And I think that that's so powerful if you kind of just sit with that for a second, right? Like that's pretty freaking amazing when you think about it. So, you know, my thought here, like, why do I start with this, is because Black liberation activism must be centered in conversations about modern activism, because it has been and continues to be the blueprint. And so what do I mean by that? I mean that, I'm going to stop sharing for a second. I mean that when you look at modern movements, or within the last 40 years or so, you look at the women's liberation, you look at queer liberation, you look at any of these other movements that have come out, you know, they really, really are modeled after the effectiveness and the movement of Black liberation work and Black power struggle and the civil rights movement. And going back even further, 100 years, you think of the Red Summer of 1919. And if I say anything that you're not familiar with, please write it down and go look it up and educate yourself, because you should want to know about this. But we're going back to the Civil War. We're going back to the over 750 documented slave rebellions that were taking place before the Civil War that nobody ever talks about. And why don't they talk about that? Because they don't want people to know or think that Black people have fought for their liberation in this nation, right? But all of this is connected. And I think one of the most important things we're seeing now is we're seeing more and more groups coming together to build upon that and expand on that groundwork that has been laid out, and working towards making, these movements happen. Does anybody, I'm going to pause now if there are any questions, if anybody has any questions. Because if not, I'll keep going. I'm also going to take a sip of my lovely juice here. All right. We have no more questions. No questions. Good. I'm going to share my screen again. I'm going to try to do this right. All right. All right. So what's going on right now, right? In this image, you see a crowd of protesters holding signs that say Black Lives Matter, silence is violence, we can do better, hands up, don't shoot. There's been a rash of police and vigilante shootings over the last several years that have really, really prompted acute responses and demonstrations against them, right? And if we're just really just talking about modern movement right now, we can go back to stop and frisk activism in 2011, 2012 in New York City. This was a really, really, really big brewing conversation that was happening. And there was a lot of activism work that was going on. And I always kind of locate us and put a pin there, because I know a lot of people will start with Trayvon Martin and, the Black Lives Matter, movement, but there was no consciousness of that without the stop and frisk. And I will even take us back to Oscar Grant in 2009. But the reason why I don't talk as much about that is because we were not all on social media the way we were in, like, say, 2011 and 2012. And so had we been, Oscar Grant may have actually gotten justice, right? The family, in the way that what we think of what justice is. But that was really, Oscar Grant's killing was the first time we saw people really online kind of hashtagging or even like using someone's name in a way that brought attention to it, right? But there just wasn't enough people online. But by 2011, 2012, we had, people across Twitter and Facebook and, these other platforms actually starting to talk about what is going on in our communities. It wasn't just fun like it was on MySpace or, things like that. It was like, okay, well, there's things happening. And so stop and frisk, anti-stop and frisk. And for those who are not familiar with stop and frisk, it was this kind of, this accepted policy where New York police were stopping Black and Latino men mostly, and basically they could stop them for whatever and frisk them and pat them down and demand their ID and ask to know where they were going and things like that. And it was personal violations. I mean, so many injuries, people having to go to the hospital, all those kinds of things. And that became a point where we're just like, no, you can't do this. You can't treat us like this. And then in 2013, when Trayvon Martin was killed by a vigilante in Florida, the Black Lives Matter movement kind of emerged from that. And while the women who created the movement were not the first to hashtag that, and I talk about that in my book, they were the ones to popularize kind of using Black Lives Matter in this particular sense, right? And so it started galvanizing, people around the country, like, what is going on, that this young boy could be killed, right? For our elders that were still alive, it reminded them of Emmett Till. It brought them back to a very painful kind of thing. And so we had young people like, again, like, this is, like, we read about this. This is not supposed to happen in our generation, right? And so then the next year, 2014, we had Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson. And before he was killed, you had Eric Garner, again, in New York City, right? Because NYPD is one of the biggest gangs in the entire world. And so they're regularly killing people. But the thing is about social media is that it brought the attention, right? So we had Eric Garner in July, we had Mike Brown in August, and then there would be more people that would come. And so 2014 was really huge for organizing demonstrations against police brutality in a way that we had not seen really since the 60s, right? The 50s and the 60s. And before that in the 19s, like when the soldiers were coming back from World War I, we saw some activity. But we had not seen anything like this, right? And all of that, and subsequently, pretty much all of it has been due to people being able to connect on social media and organize via social media, right? So when we talk about social media as a powerful tool for radical change, you will see in these pictures on the left is my cover from my last book called Reclaiming Our Space, which we spoke about earlier. But then on the right, I zoom in on the icon. It is a picture of a hand holding a smartphone in a very powerful kind of positioning, because that is really what began to happen. And I, as I was writing the book, my editor was just like, you're not talking about yourself enough. And it was odd for me, right? Yes, I've done a lot of the work and whatever, but it really wasn't about me writing about myself. I really wanted to talk about my peers and those around me who were really contributing to this forward progress in these movements. And I just happened to notice that the majority of them were Black women who identified as feminists. So I wanted to tell this story, and I wanted to capture this history as it was happening. I've always been interested in Black women's history. It's just my thing. I'm actually, doing my PhD work now, kind of really looking at that. And so what I realized was that, social media platforms were really, really, really important for connecting and building community, right? Activism comes out of this communal sense of we need change. And so you really can't have significant activism without creating community. And what social media has done, it has brought people together from around the world. And what that does is when you have someone in New York, you have someone in Kingston, Jamaica, you have someone in Cape Town, South Africa, you have someone in Paris, France, they're all identifying the same kinds of experiences, whether it's with street harassment, whether it's with sexual assault, domestic violence, police brutality, classist warfare. People are having similar experiences and realizing that they are not alone, that this is actually a global issue, or these are global issues, and that there's strength in numbers. And so social media became this great connector and has continued to be this great connector. And what I found is that Black women particularly were able and have been able to harness this tool because it's so connected to our communication styles as African and African Americans or Africans wherever we are. It's very rooted in this call and response kind of thing. It relies a lot on oral history, a lot of these videos and things that we're making, really talking to people. That is our tradition. That is what we do. Social media allows us to say what we want without having to go through gatekeepers, right? It used to be that if you had an opinion about something, you had to write an op-ed and hope that it would be published in a newspaper. Now you could just write it out on Facebook or write it out on Twitter or talk about it on Instagram and people can hear you. And what that did was it leveled the playing field for people who had been routinely erased and ignored, right? And it's primarily Black women who have, had to do that. And so what we started doing was really using the hashtag idea and the hashtag, this kind of gathering space where if you hashtagged a word and people clicked on it, they could learn a lot more. And so you had things like solidarity is for white women and you okay sis and why I stayed and me too. And, all of these other, again, say her name, Black Lives Matter, all of these kinds of hashtags that really started bringing people together to learn more about these conversations that we were having. And I think what's really interesting, and this is a point that I always bring up because people talk about hashtag activism. Sister Moya has that book out, really powerful. People try to, I guess, minimize the effectiveness of the work that we've been doing because we use social media. And what I have to remind people is that many of us have been activists since before social media existed. And for my younger folks, that is not to dismiss the work that you do and to say that it's any less important or powerful. It's just that for those of us, and I will tell you all that I'm going on 23 years of activism, recognizing the power of social media for those of us that were trying to do these things and get these things done, it's like we cannot deny that. And so with being able to use, to organize and use these platforms, the effectiveness of organizing increased. Okay. When I organized the National Moment of Silence in 2014, literally it happened 4 days after Mike Brown, 4 or 5 days after Mike Brown was killed. So after we're sitting there online, seeing videos of this young man's body in the hot sun on the ground, 4 or 5 days later, we've galvanized hundreds of thousands of people across the country and in 4 other countries outside of the United States, crossing 42 states, right? To come together at the same time to have a demonstration against police brutality and honoring the people whose lives have been lost and who have been victimized by the police. There's no way that something like that could have been organized that quickly in the 1960s or 70s or 80s. But because we had social media, we were able to connect and build and come together and have event pages and conference calls and all these kinds of things to plan this thing out in less than a week. Powerful, powerful, powerful stuff, right? And out of that particular event came a lot of the people who are still doing activism today. There are many people who will say that was their first event that they ever organized, or one of the first events that they attended that was related to police brutality. And it inspired them to go on to become activists in their own communities. It inspired them to go to college to study community organizing and things like that, really pivot in their careers. And so when you think about the power of that, right? Something that was organized primarily, 99% on social media. It created a ripple effect of change that we are still seeing today. And social media, as I stated earlier, has really recognized these global kind of, the fact that this stuff is global and is really globalized movements, right? So I've been to other countries and I've, broken bread with other activists in Paris and Johannesburg and things like that. I've been able to speak in London and other places like that because these movements are happening around the world. And social media has allowed us to globalize our movement work and our organizing so that we're attacking these issues on multiple fronts. Right? So before I get into anti-racism, does anybody have any questions? Do we have any questions at all? No? I can just keep going. I love it.
Actually,
Oh yes,
sorry.
me too. No problem.
I have a personal question.
Mhm.
And if anybody has any questions, we'll just bring them up too. But as a I don't know, I guess the word activist got slapped on my label over the
Mhm.
summer. And it's something that I'm very passionate about. What is, I guess, how do you how do you give yourself a break? Because we know, I mean, like, the work never stops. Like, there's always going to be some trial, there's always going to be some challenge. What, as a young person, like, I mean, I'm learning how to say no. It's coming a little later than I'd expect, but how, when do we stop? I guess is the question. Like, when do you take time for yourself? When, yeah, that's my question.
um, so in many ways, I pivoted. You'll never stop. Not if you're actually really about this life. You'll never stop, right? So I pivoted in the kind of work that I do. As I am older, my body ain't what it used to be. I can't be out there for several hours, in the cold like I used to, right? That's why all the revolutions that have ever happened are, started by the young people, because y'all got all the energy in the world and we need that to keep going. You end up pivoting, right, to doing other things. And so a lot of what I do now is stuff like this, right? So I do a lot of teaching. I do a lot of mentoring. I do a lot of workshops and facilitations. I do a lot of consulting. I work with activists and organizations and really consulting with them on how to improve their tactics and their strategies and things like that. Because I've been through all of that. I have the experience working in nonprofit leadership. I have the experience working in community organizing and leadership. I have all of that. And so what I try to do is really try to teach people effective ways to go about it. And that's like allowed me to ease up off some of the strain that it used to be. It really can be a constant like headache if you really don't extract yourself. We talk a lot about self-care and social work, and other people talk about it, whatever. But if you are not paying attention to your mind and your body and your spirit, you will die inside. Like whether you die outside or not, it will kill you. And I've gotten to that point, which is why I retired from social work, because I felt myself like I'm losing it, and I'm going to get to the point where I say, F all this, I'm not doing none of this ever again. And I didn't want to get to that point. So I made sure I developed an affinity for traveling. Several years ago, I just decided every year I'm going to take a solo trip by myself to hit the restart button. Usually around like February and March, I just go to another country for like a week and disconnect and, get my son and get whatever, get whatever. If I want to do some writing, whatever. And that's been really helpful for me. Not everybody can necessarily afford to do that. So some other things that I do like getting massages. I am very particular about making sure I get my nails done. Like it's just my thing. It's just something that reminds me that I'm here and I exist, and I want to make sure that I take care of that. I have learned how to say no to things. And that's not easy for somebody who cares and is a giver. So you have to just be mindful of that. You do have the right to say no. And I used to, before the pandemic, I'm not even gonna say before the pandemic. Before I started grad school, I didn't do any work on Mondays. I had a fundamental kind of thing, no work on Mondays unless they were paying me a lot of money. And even then, I would try to say, can we do this on Tuesday? I had to take that day to just put it for myself. And I think that's so important to really make sure that you are intentionally carving that time out for yourself, spending time with your friends, your family, your loved ones, where you're not talking about any of this. I love to dance, so making sure that I can go and dance sometimes. Again, we're talking in the before times, before everything changed. But really just making sure that you're prioritizing the joy that that you have the right to experience.
Okay. All right. Yes. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. So I'm gonna go back and keep going. No other questions? Okay, we're gonna wait. All right, let's go. We're about halfway there. All right. All right, y'all. Stick with me. Rock with me. Okay. So there's been a lot of conversation about anti-racism, anti-racist, Ibram Kendi, who comes out of the program that I'm currently in, wrote this book called How to Be Anti-Racist. There's a book, White Fragility, written by a white woman. Her name escapes me. Tim Wise has been doing his white splaining translation. I'm the white people translator, and gets a lot of money to tell Black people's business which we've been telling for centuries, but okay. What is an anti-racist? Technically, it is a person who opposes racism and promotes racial tolerance. Why do I have an issue with that? As you might imagine, tolerance is the bare minimum, right? I hate the word tolerance when it's used in this context. I'm not trying to tolerate anybody. I don't want anybody tolerating me. And just basically that says, I accept that you're there, but you know, I'm not gonna get in the way of you being there, but I definitely am not, oops, sorry. My phone rang because they're still calling asking for money for donations to these candidacies, right? So sorry about that. So, you know, I don't want to be tolerated. I want to be affirmed, appreciated, respected, and honored, right? So what does anti-racism work? Well, it is the work that focuses on dismantling racism, right? But who's responsible for racism? It ain't people like me. So it ain't my work to do. Paulo Freire, right, teaches us in the pedagogy of the oppressed that, you know, it ain't my job. It's not the job of the oppressed to liberate their oppressors. That is not your responsibility, right? So why is this so popular now? And I say it's because it censors whiteness. What it does is it puts white people on display. It puts them at the center. And it didn't used to do that, but it does. And it kind of, it allows white people to become the center of the conversation. And I think in some really kind of weird, twisted way, there's folks that enjoy that. They still want to be centered, even when we're talking about racism. And I argue that Black people and people, you know, I don't even want to say people of color because I hate that term actually. But anyway, anti-racist activism has been co-opted by white people in ways that alienate it from actual POC. And I have to use POC and people of color sometimes because that's the language that people speak. But I tweeted the other day, I said, you know, if you're people of color, then who are people, right? It normalizes white people as the real people, and everybody else has a hyphenated or one-off existence. And so I don't like using that, right? But I call people what they are. You know, you're African, you're Asian, you know, whatever you are, I will call you that. It's not simply about being anti-racist, because the racist is the white people, so I'm anti them, right? It's about being pro-Black. It's about being pro-Indigenous. It's about being pro-Asian. It's about being pro everybody who is not white, right? We're not competing with anyone. Anti-racist does not automatically mean that you are pro-Black people, pro-Asian people, pro-Latinx people, pro-Indigenous people. And what happens, or what ends up happening, is that you end up having these conversations where it's mostly white people in the room at the table, and they're talking about what they need to be doing to fix things or change things without really listening to the experiences and the voices of the people whose experiences, you know, with oppression are the ones that are most relevant, right? You can map out all of these plans and these ideas for how we're going to bring about institutional change. But when you look around the room, the people who are most likely to be affected by your policies are not even there, right? So there's been a lot of talk about this, and I bring that up because it's becoming really popular on social media after George Floyd was killed back in May, and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and stuff. People have really started memifying, you know, Black liberation work to a point that's really disgusts me, right? As somebody who's been doing this for a long time and who has studied and basically apprenticed with some of the most potent, you know, activists that we have right now, it really bothers me that people think it's just cool to make these memes and post these like Black squares on Instagram and think that that's action and that's movement. Or these companies are issuing their statements, right? Oh, we have this statement of, you know, we do not discriminate. Yes, you do. Yes, you do. Yes, you do. The person who wrote the statement probably wasn't even Black. So yes, you are still discriminating. You discriminate against, you know, non-white people, as we would say. You discriminate against women. You discriminate against queer people. You're going to continue to do this too. You're going to continue to do it as long as you continue to make money, right? So a lot of the performative so-called activism, it actually is quite disgusting, and it's harmful. It's harmful to the people who are actually trying to bring about, you know, liberation and real change. So what's your responsibility, right? And that's what we're here to really to talk about, is what is your responsibility, particularly in this 21st century where movements and community organizing and activism looks a lot different than it did 50, 60, 100 years ago, okay? Well, first we like to talk about, allies versus accomplices. I don't like the term allies, and I've written extensively on that because allies are extractable. When things get too tough, you as an ally can extract yourself and not be affected by, what's going on and the harms that the people who are actually oppressed are experiencing. And instead, we should have accomplices, people that are willing to walk with us and be there every single step along the way and willing to use their privileges and their access and their resources to help support these movements that are centered on and driven by the people who are oppressed, right? So if you look at what's happening out in Portland, or has been happening out in Portland, for example, right? It's primarily white people that have been fighting against the police and all these other things. It's like, but y'all are not the ones being popped off by the police. So what does this say, right? So you have like a lot of movement workers out there who are actually the ones really organizing and stuff, but the people that were getting the attention were the white people in the streets. Why? Because America can't understand why white people would want to help Black people. And you have to remember, for those of you that are not aware, white people used to get lynched for helping us too. They would get lynched, they would get fined, they would get jailed, they would get, all these problems, for helping us. So, Trump, for example, when he was talking about sending in the National Guard to cities like Portland and stuff like that, for what he was really saying was, how dare you white people help them? This is not your job. You are good white people. You don't need to do this, right? So there was a lot of focus on what the white people were doing when really it was still being driven by Black activists. So we need people that are not taking up too much space. We need people who are not trying to talk over other people or out organized. We need people who are not just hiding behind the banner of Black Lives Matter to push their own issues. What we started seeing was that a lot of people were just really upset that, with this pandemic and losing their jobs. And it's like, oh, everybody's broke now, we should fight. Where, 6 months ago, you were kind of okay with how things were going. It wasn't until it started affecting you. But then you jump behind the Black Lives Matter banner and the work that has been going on for years now to express your rage and your frustration, right? So we don't need that. We don't need allies. We need people that are accomplices. We need people who understand that our liberation is not some mutual benefit for you. It's not going to change your life. Your children weren't at risk anyway. Just be there and and recognize that this work needs to be done because you're a good person and you want the world to be better. We need people to show up and show out for sure, right? Like, the numbers that we were seeing, right? Of course, I will always say that it was because of COVID and people ain't had nothing else to do. You were stuck at home for several months since March. And then this gave a lot of people a reason to get out into the streets because they were cooped up and they wanted something to do. And they realized that it was socially acceptable to go to a protest and get out the house. But I know that if you had to work your regular job, you would not find time to join the movement. How do I know this? Because we already had this kind of movement back in 2014, and we barely saw half the numbers we're seeing right now. So, the COVID and the quarantine and all of that stuff really contributed to the numbers that we were seeing. But we need that to happen even when we don't have a global pandemic. We need that to happen even when you're not being furloughed at work. We need that to happen even when you're not working from home. We need you to show up and to show out. And what does that mean? We need you to donate and to fund and to support the work that is being done that by truly experienced people, right? We need you to vote, right? Everybody came out. We have record numbers of voting right now to try to change the people that are making the legislative decisions, right? We need you to speak out more. Stop being quiet when, the holiday season is coming up now. For those of you that are still actually planning family gatherings, hopefully they're masked, but you are talking to your racist uncle and you are talking to your bigoted grandmother and you are calling out your father for the negative things he says about transgender people. We need you to do those things and to not be quiet. We need you to use your social media platforms to amplify the work of people that, that is going on and making great change. We need you to donate to the GoFundMes and the fundraisers and things like that. That's what activism from home right now looks like. We don't really have many other options right now. It is not safe to be out there every day around masses and groups of people, not just because of the pandemic, but because our police forces and the National Guard are coming in with, they are militarized. They are coming in with warlike weaponry, okay, that they are using against their own citizens. This is absolutely an abomination. It is the worst place that we could possibly be. And when people talk about civil war and all those kinds of things, they're not making this up. There is a reason for people to be afraid and concerned about the ways in which the government is enacting retribution against people who are simply standing up and saying, or speaking out and saying, I am not going to tolerate this nonsense anymore. So it's not safe. Be careful. You all have to be careful. I do have my contact information for those of you that don't already follow me. Feminista Jones Official, Feminista Jones, Feminista Jones. Try to keep it, all the same. And so definitely, we can open it up for questions. I know we have like 15 minutes left, but I hope that you all learned a little bit or got something out of it, or some motivation or some inspiration or things like that. And I'm open for your questions.
Yes. Thank you very much, first off, for coming and speaking with us. We really appreciate it. We, well, I do have a question from one of my friends. She's actually a panelist right now, but it won't allow us to ask questions or whatnot. But she's asking, how can you combat performative activism? What is something that you can do? Because, people are out here doing it for show or doing it for the likes.
Are you meaning what other people are doing?
I believe so.
You mean combat what other people are doing? Okay. You don't need to worry about that. You don't focus on that because that's their business, right? The energy, so that's one of the issues I have, is that we spend so much time critiquing this performative action or whatever other people are doing instead of actually just going on about our business and doing the work. When the black squares were coming out, I actually spoke out against that because I do this, I study this, this is what I understand, and this is a specialty of mine. And I was like, okay, so what you all are doing right now is you're basically blacking out all of the activist communication that happens on the Black Lives Matter hashtag on Instagram. People post flyers for events, they post call to actions, they post GoFundMes and things like that. And so what ended up happening is that we had like several million black squares that were posted on a hashtag, so that when you went to look at the hashtag, that's all you saw was a sea of blackness, which is why I believe it was intentionally designed that way, and it wasn't a psyop, as we would call it, that was intentionally done, and it got all these people, celebrities and everybody, to participate in suppressing the communication tool of the Black Lives Matter hashtag. And so you have to be mindful of that. Now you can spend your time really focusing on that, but I really would rather you spend that time focusing on doing, actual work. You're going to see people that are going to do that because that's all they know how to do. They don't know any better, right? They're going to post those really ridiculous memes about arresting the people that killed Breonna Taylor. You can't arrest people for doing their jobs, foolish people. Like, you don't understand what is really going on. When somebody was talking, anybody that was talking about arrest the people that killed Breonna Taylor, I'm like, have you ever been arrested for doing your job properly? It's not about arresting those officers. It's about changing the laws that allowed them to be able to do that, because everything they did was within their job. As we noticed, only one person was like indicted or whatever, and that kind of goes along with the corruption of how these things go. So you're focusing so much of the memifying of things. Oh, here's the NBA schedule, and you swipe and it's arrest the kill. I was like, are you kidding me? Like, please get me off this planet. This is the most ridiculous nonsense. Like I just couldn't understand it. But at the same time, it's like, I'm not going to sit here and write a soliloquy underneath your posts. I'm not going to come in your comments and talk about how wrong you are. I'm going to take that energy and focus it towards an event that is trying to maybe raise money for the family or raise money for legal, lawyer fees and things like that. I don't have time for that. But I just want people to be mindful that it's kind of ridiculous to get lost in that. There's another question. In terms of the on-the-ground activism, do you advocate nonviolence like MLK or physically power response like Black Panthers? Which method do you find most effective in this current environment? before Dr. King died, he said, "I fear I have integrated my people into a burning house." Dr. King had guns in his house. He knew that, nonviolence as a theory, it's really rooted in spirituality and theology, which I don't subscribe to. So that's never been my approach to anything. I do not believe in turning the other cheek when somebody hits me. You hit me, I'm gonna punch you back. You punch me, I'm gonna shoot you. That's just human survival. I don't care who you are. And that's my collective approach to things. When you talk about powerful responses like the Black Panthers, physically powerful, I'd like to know what you're talking about. I'd like you to give me examples of the Black Panthers being physically powerful in things, because I think a lot of that is mythology, right? We do know that they showed up at the California State Capitol with the legally gun, right to hold guns or whatever. But was it a shootout at the OK Corral? No, it wasn't, actually. We can talk about Robert F. Williams and the North Carolina NAACP, where they found out that the Klan was going to attack a local physician, and they all showed up at his house with their guns waiting for the Klan, and the Klan came and the Klan left. We can talk about that, which I'm an advocate of. I am an advocate of self-defense. I'm an advocate of defending your right to live as a human being. What do I find most effective in this current environment? I don't know, because survival is important, but I also know that we are living in a country that owns the most nuclear weapons. At any given moment, the person who is currently occupying the White House could deploy a nuclear weapon and take out the entirety of us. That's why I don't go to mass gatherings anymore. I don't trust this government to not come. I've seen what they've done in West Philadelphia. They're gassing whole neighborhoods. I've seen what they're doing in Portland. I see what they've done in Ferguson. I know, and that's light work. That's light work. So I think we need to do whatever we need to do to survive and to get to a point where we're not constantly on the defense. Nonviolence doesn't make sense to me, actually.
So
that's for anyone.
I have a question about social media. To clear my peace of mind when it goes to social media, and I do post some things that are very pro-Black and make my viewers aware of things. I have a rule that if it's on somebody else's feed and they're promoting something that I am against, I don't respond. But if you come onto my post posting nonsense, I react.
Okay.
I have found myself kind of toying with, should I really react or should I just not even worry about it? Because I'm in a position where this is something that I want to do with. I want to be able to go into universities or institutions and companies and talk to them about diversity, equity, and inclusion, basically what they're doing wrong, and here's how you can do it right. So how do you toy the line of opening the line of communication to have that conversation, and when just to close it off?
That's a great question. I don't have those conversations with people anymore without compensation. I'm not going to let people gaslight me. I'm not going to let people neg me. I'm not going to let people put me in a position where I feel like I'm defending my humanity. And that's usually what happens. Somebody put some kind of comment on my Instagram or whatever. I delete it and I block them. You don't exist to me anymore. Because there's enough people that are reading this and actually having a fruitful conversation that I don't need to, to have you to be the distracting factor. That's what it is, right? It's a distraction. The people that come and they say these things, Toni Morrison said that's the purpose of racism, is to really distract us and to keep us busy fighting against it, that we're not focused on liberation. So if I spend all my time responding to people with their negative comments and their trolling or whatever, and I'm not actually putting out the content and information that those who are trying to actually get free and educate, become educated can access. So I just don't deal with it. And, when it comes to, people are like, well, I want to learn this and I want to be educated by this. I have an agent. You can contact them and you can ask them to have me come in, because this is work, right? It takes time to put, if I'm working with an organization, for example, I just did a really big project with an organization where I really was helping them address organizational trauma and the stuff that they've been going on with race and sexism and things like that. And I actually had to work with them for several weeks to do this and go through stuff. I'm not doing that for free. That's a lot of labor on my end, and I don't do that. In terms of the conversation, some people are more willing to have conversations about this stuff than others. I've actually reached a point in my life where I'm not going to have that conversation. I will give you a book to read, I will direct you somewhere else, but I'm not going to sit here and defend my humanity and prove to you that I deserve to exist. And that's really what it ends up coming down to. People want you to prove to them that you have the right to live freely as a human being based on how you look. That's not what I'm about.
All right. All right. Um,
Can you speak more on the term organizational trauma? I've never heard of that. I'll be talking about that a lot tomorrow. But simply put, it's this idea that you can recognize, like, again, so I'm a mental health social worker. I used to do counseling and things like that. And I can recognize, trauma-informed care is what we call it, right? That's the buzzword. I can recognize that when somebody is sitting in front of me and they have had a great deal of trauma that affects the way they navigate the world, right? So for example, when I was doing housing services, I was running residences where people who had been homeless for like 10, 20 years would move in, and then you'd see how their apartments would look, and it's like, well, why don't you put up curtains, or why don't you move your bed over here? Or somebody who had been incarcerated for like 20 years, why is your bed in the corner? Why, you have to address the trauma that was there to understand why they do what they do. That happens within organizations as well. So organizations who build their culture from whatever, right? Say it's a white guy who decided to start a company, and everything that comes from that is built on the culture that he created, but not realizing that the culture he created can be traumatic for people that are not white men, right? So that if you're not addressing the specific issues of sexism and racism, you're allowing trauma to flourish. You're not, if you're not addressing the fact that your policies uphold, like your handbook, you read through your handbook, and what is your handbook? How does it address these issues of sexism, racism, discrimination, queerphobia, ableism? If you're not addressing these things, I can guarantee you that there are traumatic things that are happening to your employees on a daily basis that is creating trauma within the organization, within the organizational culture. And so I try to work with, I work with companies and organizations to be able to identify those places where trauma is happening and how they can go about rectifying, making amends, and avoiding it in the future going forward.
wow. Yes. Thank you so much. We are, oh, yes, beautiful, beautiful. Speaking of tomorrow's presentation, tomorrow Feminista will be joining us again. Thank you. I appreciate everything that you have said so far, and I look forward to your next presentation. But we'll be talking about nonprofit organizational leadership. So talking about D&I and addressing gender bias in the workplace. So if you haven't RSVP'd, please do that. It is going to be as informational as this one. So without further ado, thank you very much. We are going to close out, and we hope to see you tomorrow.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. I really appreciate it, and thank you for having me. I hope to see you all tomorrow.
Yes. Farewell.
Right on.